They went quiet, and then, at some point, in a moment you may or may not have seen coming, they didn't. Something moved them, something specific, identifiable, psychologically coherent, not random, not the mysterious, inexplicable behaviour that the avoidant pattern sometimes gets reduced to in popular conversation. A real, traceable trigger, something that shifted the internal calculus in a direction that made reaching out feel, for the first time since the silence began, more necessary than staying quiet. Understanding what those triggers are is not about learning how to engineer them. It is about understanding the psychology well enough to stop interpreting the silence as a verdict and the eventual breaking of it as either miracle or manipulation. Both of those interpretations miss what is actually happening. What is actually happening is a specific nervous system encountering specific conditions that override its preference for managed distance. Not magic, not strategy succeeding. The specific, predictable, psychologically grounded mechanics of a particular attachment system reaching its own internal threshold. Here are the 7 triggers that most reliably produce that threshold being crossed. 1. The moment they encounter something only you would understand. Daily life, for the avoidant in the silence, continues functioning. Work proceeds. Friendships continue at whatever level they were maintained before. The ordinary texture of existence does not stop because the relationship ended or paused. But within that ordinary texture, something happens with surprising frequency. A moment arrives, small, specific, unremarkable to anyone else, that belongs to the private language of what existed between you. An inside reference, a shared joke, a piece of music or a particular kind of afternoon, or a turn of phrase that is, in the specific way that these things become specific inside a genuine relationship, associated exclusively with you. In that moment, the impulse to share it arrives before the management system can intercept it, before the deactivating strategies can generate the counter-narrative, before the avoidant has consciously registered that the impulse is there. The impulse is already moving. The suppression of it, the pulling back from the reach that was already in motion, is felt as loss in a very particular way. Not the abstract loss of the relationship in general, the concrete, specific loss of the one person to whom this moment could have been sent, who would have understood it in the exact right way, who would have responded with precisely the quality of recognition that nobody else in the current relational landscape can produce. The accumulation of these moments, each one suppressed, each one adding to the weight of what is missing, eventually exceeds the suppression capacity. The reach that was prevented 15 times produces, on the 16th or the 30th or the 45th, the reach that is not prevented. The message that arrives is often small, superficially lightweight, a reference to the shared thing, nothing that announces the full weight of what is behind it. The full weight is always behind it. 2. The visible evidence that you have genuinely moved forward, not performed moving forward, the real thing. And the avoidant system, as noted throughout this series, distinguishes between the two with a precision that bypasses rational analysis. When genuine evidence of your forward movement enters the avoidant's awareness, through mutual connections, through something visible in the shared periphery, through the simple quality of your presence if contact occurs, something specific happens in the system. The background assumption that was running, that you were, at some level, still oriented toward them, still in the orbit that made the distance manageable and affordable, loses its footing. The picture it was relying on updates, and the update produces immediate recalibration. The distance that was comfortable when you were predictably present becomes less comfortable when your presence is no longer predictable. The silence that felt like an available option when you seemed to be waiting becomes more costly when waiting is no longer what you appear to be doing. The avoidant does not experience this as jealousy in the clean, simple sense. It is more specific. It is the nervous system revising upward the urgency of something it had been deferring, the acknowledgement of what you meant, the recognition of what your absence actually costs, in response to the evidence that deferral is no longer a stable option. The reach that follows is often framed as casual, as checking in, as something that has nothing obviously to do with what produced it. The casualness is the management system attempting to maintain deniability, while the impulse beneath it is anything but casual. 3. A moment of significant personal difficulty. The avoidant self-sufficiency is real, genuinely developed. The capacity to navigate difficulty without external support is not performed. It was built through necessity and has been refined through decades of application. It also has limits, and those limits become most visible in the specific quality of difficulty that is not primarily practical, but existential. The loss. The failure that touches something deep about identity. The moment of genuine vulnerability, where the competence that usually feels sufficient reveals that it was never designed to be sufficient for this particular kind of weight. In those moments, the avoidance system scans the relational landscape for something it does not usually admit to needing. Not generic support. The specific quality of being with someone who actually knows them, who does not require the competent presentation, who can receive the real version of what is happening without the avoidant having to manage the receiver's response to it. You were that person, the one who saw past the surface presentation, who created the specific condition of being known without performance requirements. The avoidant in difficulty does not think, I need support and any support will do. They think in the specific, involuntary, not fully conscious way the avoidant thinks about things that matter, of the person who provided the specific quality of being with that is now absent. And the thought produces the impulse, and the impulse, in the context of sufficient difficulty, sometimes produces the reach. 4. The failure of replacement. The avoidant who has ended or distanced from a significant connection does not typically immediately pursue replacement. The initial period is usually marked by the relief of reduced activation and the restored comfort of self-sufficiency. But time continues. New connections form or are attempted. The ordinary relational landscape of the avoidance life continues to operate. And in that continuation, something becomes increasingly clear. That the management strategies were not designed to reveal. The specific quality of what you provided is not available elsewhere. Not because others are inadequate, because what you brought was specific. The combination of how you thought and how you saw them and how you loved and what you created in the space between you is not a category that other people inhabit. It was particular to you. And the search for something that approximates it, which the avoidant may not consciously register as a search, but which the nervous system is conducting nonetheless, keeps returning empty. The encounter with a new person who is interesting but does not quite produce what you produced. The conversation that is good but does not reach the specific depth that conversations with you reached. The company that is pleasant but does not carry the specific quality of ease and recognition that your company carried. Each of these encounters provides new data. The data accumulates. The accumulation eventually produces a conclusion the management strategies work to prevent but cannot indefinitely. What was lost was not replaceable. And the irreplaceability, registered fully, produces urgency where deferral had been comfortable, produces the reach where silence had been the preference, produces the breaking of the quiet, not because the avoidant decided to break it, but because the evidence made continued silence feel, for the first time, like a cost the system was no longer willing to pay. 5. The anniversary or seasonal trigger. Time is not neutral. It carries meaning that the deactivating strategies are not well equipped to manage, because the meaning is embedded in the physical experience of time's passage, rather than in a thought that can be redirected or a feeling that can be suppressed. A date arrives, a season changes. The specific time of year when something significant happened between you, the beginning, a particular moment, the quality of a specific period, arrives again in the calendar and in the atmosphere. The light is the same light. The temperature carries the same quality. The particular arrangement of the world that existed when you were in it together reappears, uninvited, in the present. The avoidant cannot deactivate a season, cannot minimize October if October is when something real happened, cannot redirect the specific, involuntary, sensory-triggered memory that arrives not as a thought to be managed, but as a physical experience of time that once contained something significant. These temporal triggers produce some of the most genuine, least managed breaks in the avoidant silence. Because they arrive before the management system has been activated to respond to them, they are felt before they are processed, and by the time the processing begins, the impulse has already formed. The message sent after a long silence in the middle of a season that belonged to something real between you is rarely an accident. The avoidant often cannot fully explain why they reached out at that specific time. The explanation lives in the sensory, the memorial, the part of experience that precedes rational account. 6. Something you created reaching them. The avoidant move through your life at enough proximity to know something about who you are at your best. Your work, your thinking, your creative or intellectual or professional output when it is operating at the level your actual capacity produces. When something you have made, written, built, produced, accomplished, reaches them through the ordinary channels of a shared social world, it does not arrive as neutral information. It arrives as the specific, concentrated, undeniable evidence of what you are. Not what you were to them, or what the relationship was, or whether the pattern would repeat. What you are. As an independent, functioning, producing human being, whose quality of output reflects the quality of the interior the avoidant had access to and managed carelessly. The pride, and this is the right word, however uncomfortable it sits, that the avoidant feels encountering your work or your achievement in the aftermath of the relationship is genuine, mixed with regret, complicated by the specific recognition that the person who produced this was also the person they treated with insufficient adequacy, but genuine in its orientation toward your actual quality. And pride in someone, mixed with regret about how they were treated, is one of the more reliable producers of the reach, because it combines the pull of genuine regard with the push of the reckoning that the regard makes unavoidable. Because sitting with the pride and the regret simultaneously, without doing anything, becomes, at some threshold, less sustainable than reaching toward the person both feelings are about. 7. The direct question from inside. This trigger is the most interior and the least visible from the outside. It is also, in many ways, the most significant, because it is the one that does not depend on external conditions, that is entirely self-generated, that arrives not because something in the environment produced it, but because the avoidant's own interior, running its quiet and unwitnessed reckoning, reaches a point that demands response. The question is simple, devastating in its simplicity. What if I am making a mistake? Not a rhetorical question, a genuine one. Arriving in the middle of something ordinary, without announcement, with the specific weight of a question that the management strategies cannot answer, because the management strategies were not designed to evaluate genuine relational value. They were designed to manage activation. They were designed to maintain distance. They were not designed to tell the avoidant whether the distance, in this specific case, with this specific person, at this specific juncture, is actually the right answer. And the honest response to that honest question, arriving in the quiet, without the distortion that the relationship's activation produced, is uncertain in a way that comfortable silence cannot survive. The uncertainty produces the reach. Not certainty that a mistake was made, not the conviction that reunion is necessary. The genuine, honest, undeniable uncertainty of someone who no longer trusts the management system's automatic output as accurate and wants, for the first time, to find out what the actual answer is. The avoidant who reaches out from this trigger is reaching from a more honest place than any of the others. Not because the others are dishonest, each one is a real response to a real internal state. Because this one requires the most direct confrontation with the management system's limitations, the most explicit acknowledgement that the system that was trusted to handle this may have gotten something wrong. That acknowledgement, however private and however imperfectly expressed in the reaching that follows, is the beginning of something worth taking seriously. 7 triggers. 7 distinct internal thresholds, 7 specific conditions under which the avoidance system crosses from maintained silence into the reach that breaks it. None of them require you to do anything, not produce anything, not change anything, not engineer any specific circumstance. They arise from the specific internal mechanics of an architecture encountering the real consequences of its own operation. What you do when the silence breaks, whether it breaks or not, from wherever you currently stand in your own life, is the only part of this that belongs to you. The triggers belong to them. The response belongs entirely to you. And the response, made from the clearest, most self-possessed, most genuinely grounded version of yourself, not from the relief of the breaking or the fear of the silence returning, is the only response worth making, whatever that response is.